They always say that home is the safest place on earth, a sanctuary where the world's noise fades away. But as I sit here on my porch in the sweltering July heat of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, I can tell you that for some of us, home was where the monster lived. My name is Jessica Randall, though most folks here just call me Miss Jessica. I'm 73 now, with skin like parchment and memories that weigh more than my tired bones can carry. For 60 years, I've kept a secret locked behind my teeth, a story that would make your soul tremble. I was born in 1951, a time when little girls in the South were taught to be like porcelain dolls, pretty to look at, but expected to remain silent. My father, John Randall, was a man of whiskey and nuclear plant dust. He was a man who believed a son was worth 10 daughters. To him, I was a miscalculation, a shadow in the corner of his house. But his son, my older brother Tony was the son he rotated around. Tony was 5 years older than me, tall and handsome with startling green eyes that didn't belong to anyone else in our family. The neighbors called him a heartbreaker. Little did they know, the first heart he set out to destroy was mine. It started slow, like a creeping vine, a look that lasted too long, a hand that lingered where it shouldn't. I was a child. I didn't have the words for what was happening. I just knew that when the sun went down, the air in our shared bedroom felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. My mother, Martha, was a saint with calloused hands from washing other people's laundry. She tried to protect me, but in our house my father's word was law and Tony was his deputy. "Stay quiet, child," she would whisper when my father's temper flared. "It'll pass." But the things Tony did didn't pass. They grew darker. I remember my 9th birthday. I was wearing a yellow dress Mom had sewn for me. Everyone was complimenting how I was becoming a young lady. I saw the rage in Tony's eyes. He pulled me aside and hissed, "You're mine. Do you hear me? Mine." That cold fear traveled up my spine like a winter frost. I tried to tell Mom, but when I saw the reflection of my own terror in her eyes, I realized the most heartbreaking truth a child can learn. I was completely alone. My mother knew, but she was too broken to speak. My father was too proud to see. And the monster? He was just getting started. As I grew, the nightmare only intensified. But nothing could have prepared me for the day my body began to change and the monster decided it was time for my childhood to end forever. You might think you know how this story goes, but the real horror started on the night of my 11th birthday, a night that would leave a mark on my soul that even 60 years couldn't wash away. Stick with me, because what happened next is something I've never told a living soul until now. The summer of 1962 didn't feel like a summer of innocence. While other kids in Tennessee were dreaming of the New York World's Fair or listening to Elvis on the radio, I was living in a state of constant suffocating surveillance. My brother Tony was no longer just a bully. He was a predator who moved through our house with the confidence of a king. By the time I was 11, the incidents weren't just whispers in the dark anymore. They were cold, calculated moments of stolen childhood. My father, John, remained blissfully or perhaps willfully blind. To him, Tony was the star athlete, the boy who helped him at the plant, the legacy of the Randall name. Whenever I tried to speak, whenever I so much as whimpered in the presence of my father, his voice would boom like thunder. "Making things up again, girl. You always were a dreamer, just like your mother." My mother, Her silence was the loudest sound in the house. She would scrub the floors until her knuckles bled, her eyes fixed on the soapy water, never meeting mine. She knew. I saw it in the way she tucked me in at night, her hands trembling as she smoothed the sheets, as if she were trying to iron out the trauma she couldn't prevent. She was a victim of her time, trapped in a marriage where a woman's voice was as thin as a spider's web. Then came the night of the harvest festival. The town was alive with lights and laughter, but our house was quiet. My parents had gone out to celebrate, leaving Tony in charge of me. That was the mistake that changed the trajectory of my life. I remember the smell of the Tennessee pines drifting through the open window and the distant sound of the fairground music. It felt like the rest of the world was moving toward joy, while I was being pulled into an abyss. That night, Tony didn't just cross a line, he erased it. He walked into my room with a look of ownership that still haunts my dreams. I pleaded with him. I told him I'd tell Dad, even though I knew Dad wouldn't listen. Tony just laughed, a hollow, jagged sound. "He won't believe a word from a hysterical little girl," he whispered. In the aftermath of that night, I didn't cry. The tears simply dried up inside me, replaced by a cold, hard stone in the pit of my stomach. I stopped being a child that night. I became a ghost, haunting my own skin. But the universe has a cruel way of making sure secrets don't stay buried. A few weeks later, the morning sickness began. It wasn't just a flu, and it wasn't a stomach bug, as I tried to tell my mother. At 14, while most girls were worrying about their first dance, I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, watching my waistline disappear and my nightmare take a physical form. The belly that grew inside me wasn't a symbol of life. It felt like a ticking time bomb of shame. When the truth finally became impossible to hide, the explosion didn't come from Tony. It came from my father. But the blow he dealt me wasn't with his hands. It was with a decision so heartless it would force me to make a choice no child should ever have to make. I had to decide, would I save myself, or would I save the innocent life growing inside me? What happened next at the doctor's office changed the Randall family tree forever, and it's the reason why my son, Charles, grew up believing a beautiful lie. The morning air in our kitchen usually smelled of fried bacon and chicory coffee, but the day the truth came out, it smelled like copper and fear. I was 14. And the loose sweaters could no longer hide the swelling curve of my stomach. My mother had finally cornered me in the pantry, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. When I finally whispered the name Tony, she didn't scream. She didn't even cry. She just collapsed onto a kitchen chair, covering her mouth, as if to keep her soul from escaping. But the silence didn't last. My father, John, walked in. He saw my mother's broken state and my trembling hands. When the words were repeated to him, I expected him to roar in defense of his daughter. I expected him to throw Tony out of the house. Instead, the room went ice cold. He didn't look at Tony, who stood in the doorway with a smirk that chilled my blood. He looked at me. "You're lying," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You've always been jealous of your brother. You went out and got yourself into trouble with some gutter boy, and now you want to drag this family's name through the mud by blaming your own flesh and blood?" The betrayal felt like a physical blow to my chest. He chose the monster. He chose the golden son over the broken daughter. He didn't see a victim. He saw a nuisance. He saw a stain on his perfect reputation in Oak Ridge. Within 48 hours, I was packed into the back of our old Ford. We weren't going to the police. We weren't going to a hospital. We were driving to a small, gray house on the outskirts of town, a place where difficult girls were sent to disappear. My father had arranged for me to be hidden away until the problem was resolved. He told the neighbors I had gone to stay with an aunt in Virginia to help with her illness. In that gray house, I was no longer Jessica. I was just a number. The women there were stern, their hearts hardened by years of dealing with society's shame. They told me my only path to redemption was to give the baby up and never speak of this again. Forget he exists, the head matron would say, and you can go back to your life as if nothing happened. But as I felt the first kick, a tiny rhythmic thud against my ribs, something shifted inside me. This wasn't a problem. This wasn't a shame. This was a life. And for the first time in my 14 years, I realized that if I didn't fight for this child, no one would. My father wanted to bury the truth, and my brother wanted to destroy it. But as I sat in that lonely room, staring at the moonlight on the floor, I made a silent vow. I would not let them win. I would not let this baby be another victim of the Randall name. But how does a 14-year-old girl with no money and a family that has disowned her survive in a world that wants her to fail? I had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan to escape that gray house. But on the night I decided to run, the labor pains started, 3 months too early. I was alone, terrified, and bleeding in the dark. I realized then that to save my son, I would have to tell the biggest lie of my life, a lie that would last for 60 years. The night my son was born, there were no blue balloons, no celebratory cigars, and no proud father waiting in the hallway. There was only the sound of a relentless Tennessee rain drumming against the tin roof of that gray house, and the agonizing screams I had to bite back so the matrons wouldn't punish me for being dramatic. I was 14, a child myself, giving birth in a room that felt more like a prison cell than a nursery. When the nurse finally placed that tiny, shivering bundle in my arms, I froze. I expected to feel resentment. I expected to see the face of the monster who had ruined my life. But as I looked down, I saw a pair of wide, innocent eyes, and they were green, the same startling green as Tony's. A cold shiver ran through me, but then the baby reached out a microscopic hand and brushed my cheek. In a moment, the hatred evaporated. This baby wasn't a mistake or a shame. He was a clean slate. He was mine. I named him Charles. Not after my father, and certainly not after his biological father. I named him for the strength I knew he would need to survive a world that had already judged him. But I knew I couldn't stay in Oak Ridge. If I stayed, my father would eventually force me to give him up, or Tony would find a way to hurt us both. So 2 weeks after Charles was born, with my body still aching and my heart pounding in my throat, I did the unthinkable. I waited until the house was silent, wrapped Charles in 3 layers of wool blankets, and climbed out of the laundry room window. I had $42 I'd stolen from my father's emergency jar and a small bag of diapers. I walked until my legs felt like lead, eventually hitching a ride with a truck driver headed toward Memphis. He didn't ask questions. He just saw a girl with a baby and a look in her eyes that said she'd jump out of the moving truck if he tried anything. It was on that long, dark drive that I realized I couldn't tell Charles the truth. How do you tell a boy that he is the product of a nightmare? How do you tell him that his grandfather hated him before he was even born? I looked at his sleeping face and decided right then, I would give him a father he could be proud of. I would build a hero out of thin air. I began to craft the beautiful lie. I told myself, and eventually him, that his father was a young engineer, a brilliant man who had worked at the nuclear plant. I told him we were deeply in love, a young summer romance cut short by a tragic accident. I gave this fictional man a name, a personality, and a soul. I made him kind, brave, and honorable, everything my own father and brother were not. I moved to a new town, changed my last name to Smith, and started a life as a young widow. I took jobs cleaning houses, scrubbing floors until my fingers were raw, all to ensure Charles had a life of dignity. But as Charles grew older, his questions became more specific. He wanted to know about his father's family. He wanted to see photos. And most of all, he wanted to know why we never went back to Oak Ridge. For 20 years, the lie held firm. Charles grew into a magnificent man, a man of character and kindness, believing he came from a lineage of heroes. But secrets have a way of rotting from the inside out. On the day of Charles's college graduation, a letter arrived at our door. It had no return address, but I recognized the jagged, cruel handwriting immediately. Tony had found us, and he wasn't coming for an apology. He was coming to claim what he believed belonged to him. The letter sat on my kitchen table like a coiled rattlesnake. There was no return address, but that slanted, aggressive handwriting was a ghost I had spent 20 years trying to exorcise. I didn't even have to open it to feel the temperature in the room drop. When I finally forced my trembling fingers to tear the envelope, only one sentence was written inside. I saw his picture in the Memphis Gazette. "He has my eyes, Jessica. I'm coming to claim what's mine." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. My son Charles had just graduated at the top of his class. The local newspaper had run a story about the brilliant son of a hard-working widow. That one moment of pride had accidentally put a target on our backs. For 20 years, I had built a fortress of lies to protect Charles from the truth of his origin. I had invented a hero for a father, a man of honor and sacrifice. Now the monster was coming to tear that fortress down. 2 days later, a black sedan pulled up to the curb of our modest house. Out stepped a man who looked like a polished version of the nightmare from my youth. Tony was well-dressed, smelling of expensive cologne and old tobacco. He walked up my driveway with the entitlement of a king returning to his land. "You've done well for yourself, little Jess," he said, his voice smooth like oil. "And the boy? He looks just like me. It's time he knew who his real family is. It's time he knew he's a Randall." I stood on my porch, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I didn't move. "He is a Smith," I hissed, my voice low so Charles wouldn't hear from the living room. "He has no father but the one I gave him. If you take one more step, I will end this right here." Tony laughed that same hollow, jagged laugh from the night of the Harvest Festival. "With what? You're still that scared little girl in the yellow dress. You won't say a word, because if you tell him the truth, you'll destroy him. You'll have to tell him he's the son of a monster, as you call me. You'll have to admit your whole life is a lie." He was right. That was his power. He knew I loved Charles more than I hated him. He knew that the truth would shatter Charles's identity. his pride, and his future. Tony wasn't there because he loved Charles. He was there because he wanted to own the one thing I had managed to save from the wreckage of our family. I looked into those green eyes, the same eyes my son had, and I realized that the beautiful lie was no longer just a story. It was a shield, and I would have to commit the ultimate sin to keep that shield in place. I realized that to protect the man my son had become, I would have to face the man my brother was, one last time, in a way that would leave my own soul scarred forever. I did something that night that I've never forgiven myself for. I made a deal with the devil to keep the angels safe. I gave Tony something he wanted even more than legacy, something that ensured he would disappear and never breathe a word to Charles. But the cost of that deal was a secret so heavy it nearly broke me. And just when I thought the danger had passed, Charles walked onto the porch, holding the letter I thought I had hidden. He looked at me, then at the stranger in the sedan, and asked the one question I had dreaded for 2 decades. "Mom, who is this man and why does he have my eyes?" Part 6. The Legacy of the Light. Estimated word. Count 620 words. The silence that followed Charles's question was heavier than any physical weight I had ever carried. He stood there, the letter trembling in his hand, looking from me to the man in the car who shared his face, his height, and those unmistakable green eyes. My heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. I had 2 choices: tell him the truth and destroy the man I had spent 20 years building, or double down on the lie to save his soul. I looked at Tony. He was smiling, a predator waiting for the kill. He wanted me to break. He wanted to see the look of disgust in Charles' eyes when he realized his mother was a liar. I took a deep breath, stepped toward my son, and took the letter from his hand. "He's a ghost from a past that doesn't belong to you, Charles," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I looked directly at Tony, my eyes hard as flint. "This man is a distant relative from Oak Ridge. He's troubled Charles. He spent his life trying to claim things that aren't his because he has nothing of his own. He's here to ask for money, using old family names as leverage." Tony's smile vanished. He opened his mouth to protest, to shout the truth, but I cut him off. "If you say one word," I whispered, loud enough only for him, "I will call the sheriff. I have the records from the gray house. I have the letters Mom left me before she died. I will burn your reputation to the ground before you can even finish a sentence. Go back to your hollow life, Tony. You have no son here." Whether it was the fire in my eyes or the mention of the sheriff, Tony saw that he couldn't win. He was a coward at heart, just like our father. He slammed the car door and drove away, the tires screeching against the pavement, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the smell of burnt rubber. Charles looked at me for a long time. I could see the questions swirling in his mind. He wasn't a fool. He knew there was more to the story. But then he looked at the house we had built, a home filled with books, laughter, and unconditional support. He looked at the mother who had worked 3 jobs to put him through school. He reached out, took my hand, and squeezed it. "I don't care who he was, Mom," he said softly. "I know who I am, and I know who you are." He never asked about the green eyes again. Today, at 73, I sit on this porch and watch my grandchildren play in the yard. My grandson has those same green eyes, For a long time, I hated them. But now, when I look at him, I see something different. I see that appearance doesn't define character. Evil isn't something you inherit in your blood. It's something you choose. My son is a good man. My grandchildren are kind souls. I took a cursed inheritance, and through the power of a beautiful lie, I transformed it into a blessing. I am taking this secret to the grave, not out of shame, but out of love. I protected him his whole life from a truth that would have served no purpose but to cause pain. Some might call me a liar, but I call myself a survivor. My name is Jessica Smith, the woman who chose life over death, love over hate, and a beautiful lie over a soul-crushing truth. If you've stayed with me through this journey, I want to thank you for listening to a grandmother's heart. My story isn't just about pain. It's about the strength we find when we have something worth protecting. If this story touched your soul, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps me know that my voice is finally being heard after 60 years of silence. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know how far this story of survival has traveled. Be strong, stay brave, and remember, you are the author of your own legacy. Until next time.